the Bank of England will directly finance the extra spending needs of the UK government on a temporary basis, allowing the Treasury to bypass the bond market. WTO says world trade will contract up to 32%. Actually, I expect much more higher than this. We are indeed going through an extraordinary period. Turkey also acted very quickly to introduce measures to ensure the stability of its economy, including by cutting interest rates, providing liquidity, and earmarking 100 billion Turkish lira in relief for those affected by the virus. Nevertheless, like every other nation is suffering from this pandemic, so is Turkey. There have now been over 38,000 confirmed cases of the virus in Turkey. Our thoughts go out to all those affected in Turkey and also across the globe. The statistics say there are now more than 1.4 million cases worldwide in about 185 countries. Today, we aim to discuss how the US, EU, Turkey, and emerging markets have responded to the crisis, and what needs to be done further to ensure the resilience of our economies during this challenging time. I am delighted to be joined today by our distinguished panelists. Starting with, just in alphabetical order, Albright Stonebridge Group Senior Advisor, Mr. Hakan Akbaş, BlueBay Asset Management Senior Emerging Markets Sovereign Strategist, Mr. Tim Ash, Mr. John Lipsky, Director of Programs at the Atlantic Council's Global Business and Economic Program, and Mr. Hakan Yurdakul, Member of the Economic Policies Council at the Turkish Presidency. I would like to welcome all our distinguished panelists, and without further delay, let's jump into our discussion. Josh, let me start with Josh Lipsky. Josh, my first question to you, maybe we can start with a general overview of the US economy and also the globe. Do you believe countries around the world are taking sufficient measures to mitigate the economic challenges, which are, again, as we discussed, extraordinary? For example, US economy is during this pandemic setting up new facilities to deliver credit to small businesses and municipalities, and expanding measures introduced last month to back corporate debt markets. And recently, an historic $2 trillion stimulus bill is adopted. Would it be better for, and also, let's start for this actually, before moving to the comparison. So let me take your first comment on the stimulus and economic package response of the United States and what you think about this. Thank you, Josh.
Great. Well, thank you, Defne, and thank you everyone for joining, and honored to be part of this group in this distinguished panel. So I'll answer the question this way. The US, both on fiscal and monetary, especially on monetary, has done an excellent job so far, and it's not nearly enough to combat the nature of the crisis. And I think you did an excellent job giving the scope of what we're seeing both here in the US and around the world, and I know we're going to get into it in our conversation today. But just to wrap our heads around a little what's happening, as you said, 6.6 million jobs lost last week. We're probably looking at north of 17 or 18 million for the April jobs report. It's just a really shocking number. I've described it before as the American economy and the global economy going from full speed to full stop and no one having their seatbelts on. I mean, this is what's happening, and we've never really encountered anything like it, at least in our lifetimes. And as Carmen Reinhardt and others have said, even going back to the Great Depression, it was a different situation that didn't materialize as rapidly globally like this. So what the US has done on fiscal with the 2.2 trillion stimulus was the first step. It was about 10% of GDP, 11% of GDP, much needed, much larger than what we saw in 2009. So it did meet the moment, but it would be a mistake to think that we could stop there. And Congress is now debating to do a temporary measure between that stimulus and the next round of stimulus. I think that's necessary and it needs to happen quickly and it can't wait. Congress isn't supposed to reconvene until after Easter now. That would be a mistake. So there's more that needs to be done on fiscal. And you have to give credit to the Fed in the US. They are really stepping up in a way that they didn't back in 2009. There's more quantitative easing and liquidity in the markets now from the Fed in just 3 weeks than we saw over 6 years compared to 2009, 2014 to this period. And just this morning, they announced new measures that's going to infuse about 2.3 trillion into some of the credit markets that really need it. And that's a step the Fed in the past has been hesitant to take. So we have to give credit where credit's due. But it's just simply not enough. And it's hard for policymakers, I know, to wrap their heads around and think creatively. But they have to do it both here in the US and around the world. And the US has a second challenge, which is while they focus on their own house, which is burning, and help people recover and get through this period, they also have to lead the world economically. And that's something that's been lacking so far. We know that coordinated fiscal stimulus, synchronized fiscal stimulus, has multiplier effects. The total is more than the sum of its parts. And the US did this along with its European allies in 2009 at the London G20 summit, where the leaders agreed to $5 trillion of global stimulus. And I think that's what's missing right now, a US-led call for coordinated fiscal stimulus. We can talk about the IMF and their speech this morning, the managing director's speech, which got into this. But I think it's a real challenge to manage your own house while leading the world. But the US has done that in the past in a crisis, and I think we need to see the US do that again. So I'll leave it there for now and look forward to the conversation.
Josh, I agree with you actually, I think it is also, just why everybody else is thinking to put their house in order and, meeting the needs of their own economies. I think United States need to step up with some international organizations, for also other countries. I totally agree with you on this. And also, just to, complete, you just mentioned, and before moving on to my next panelist, for your first round of questions, do you think, would it be better for countries around the world as, to cooperate, and coordinate their responses rather than each tackling this issue on national basis, which is happening at this moment?
The answer to your question is yes. It would be better to coordinate. And, coordinate can mean different things. And these terms are used, the IMF uses these terms, synchronize versus coordinate. The point is to inject fiscal stimulus in a way that makes the most sense to protect employees and employers. That depends on country, but to do it at the same time in a way that's calibrated. And that's what I mean by the multiplier effects and the total being sum of the parts. And also just the announcement of this happening creates confidence in the markets and the private credit markets. And that's what we haven't seen. So it's not just the act of injecting the stimulus, it's talking about doing it in a coordinated way that builds confidence. So both of those things, especially on the public confidence building, I think are lacking right now at the international level.
I agree very much, just so since we have wonderful 4 distinguished panelists, I will move on to Hakan Akbaş from Albright Group with my first round of questions to him. Hakan, thanks again joining us today. Could you also share your comments as well on how you think the US has responded to the crisis and how you compare this with the EU response?
Thank you, Defne, for the introduction, and so delighted to be among such really distinguished panelists. And obviously, the entire world has sleepwalked into probably the biggest crisis since 1918. And so it is always easy to blame the governments or the health systems, but again, this is unprecedented. And as you have the saying in Turkish that it takes a nasty storm to make a great captain. I think as a result of this pandemic, what we're seeing is whether you will emerge out of this stronger is a question of 2 things: the quality of your governance, as a state, and also the quality of your public healthcare system. And from the perspective of, I guess, how U.S., the largest superpower in the world, has responded fiscally, I think Josh has done a great job of really underlining it. But I think that given we already have over 1.5 million cases, which was less than a million only a week ago, just help us better understand what we are up against. I think in my assessment, what the world would have expected from the U.S. president is to really lead the entire world through this unprecedented epidemic. Whether it's the global coordination of healthcare resources, whether it's the global coordination of scientists to come up with vaccines, or whether to really mobilize WHO as opposed to sort of picking on the organization. And on the other hand, also there's this obviously issue of the quality and the readiness of global organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, United Nations, which we know is largely funded by and also led by the US. So from that perspective, I just wanted to touch on the sort of the lack of readiness on behalf of the U.S. president and the world's sort of superpower in this epidemic. It's almost like, hey, the America First policy has become a U.S. Totally isolating itself. But we know that this virus threat is global, this crisis is global, and only we can navigate through this with global leadership and coordination. So let me just leave the US response there and switch to EU. Obviously, when there has been a similar crisis in the world, for example, 2008, US always came out of it more faster and more in a more resilient way. And part of it is just a single state, despite the federal versus state governments. But this pandemic is going to be a make or break test for EU. We've all been reading about so many deaths in Italy, in Spain, and officials from the two countries literally like burning down the EU flags and sort of showing their anger and resentment for Brussels. And obviously, these are unprecedented times. And unfortunately, this crisis may have really shown the fundamental structural sort of weaknesses in the governance of EU. Having said that, the premise and the threat that EU is facing is just historic. I mean, you may have heard the numbers. We're looking at Germany shrinking 10%. We're looking at France, shrinking almost, 18%, which is never seen since World War II. So this is truly a World War III sort of event for EU. And that's why it's going to show the world whether these countries will go back to what they know the best, i.e., being a nation state as they were before World War II, or they will tackle this collectively and they will leverage one currency, one market, and the benefit of having a sort of an integrated a central bank to be able to tackle this with the right economic policies to be able to manage the post-epidemic fiscal disaster. And as you've been reading since March 29th, basically all the finance ministers, they've been trying to come up with the amount of the what I would call the Corona bond issuing, that will probably be all the way up to €500 billion going forward. But obviously, there are a lot of tensions. There's a lot of tensions between Italy and Spain that will need the money most, vis-a-vis Germany and France, let alone there's also Holland that have been really preventing a sort of an agreement and a consensus on how to move forward. So again, it remains to be seen if the EU leadership will live up to the task, but the threat and the crisis is global, and therefore EU needs to get its act together and not only come up with the healthcare response and the fiscal response, including the bailouts that is required to come out of this stronger. But time will be the judge.
Hakan, thank you. Thank you for your comment. It's really, really very, in a way, kind of fascinating, just to see the EU not really reaching at a consensus on such an important issue, and it also shows that how the world and the economies are not prepared to such a crisis as well. Absolutely, there is no backup plans for anyone, and the crisis is just happening, and still the discussion is going on. Okay, I really would like to, move very quickly to Tim to talk about a bit markets perspective. Tim, welcome again, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful, Tim. Just as analysts have noted that emerging markets will suffer the most by the time this crisis is over. Could you talk about how this has affected the EM, particularly compared to developed economies, and what makes it different, potentially more disruptive, and how Turkey is positioned to handle the economic challenge within this environment as well? So before we move on to our Turkish government panelists, I think it's also good to talk about Turkey a bit from your angle. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, well, I guess most people, we have to hold up our hands and say, it's unprecedented, but I think many countries and individuals didn't really take this seriously at the outset, and I'd hold my hand up as well. I didn't think it would get as bad as it has done, and I guess, we talked about the crisis response from developed markets. And I guess, if you think about that, I mean, people didn't take it seriously enough at the start. And in terms of crisis response, we missed out the bazooka stage and went straight to kind of tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, the stimulus and fiscal stimulus and monetary measures we're seeing, as has already been mentioned, absolutely huge. And I guess the lack of coordination initially also made things a lot worse. And there's, we're in a position where I think we're going to see, a much bigger response than I guess, probably would have been justified if, we all saw this coming and we acted in a coordinated manner at the outset. I guess emerging markets are in a similar situation. I mean, if you go back a month and a half, there was a general consensus view, I guess, that emerging market, this was kind of a DM, rich countries kind of problem. The virus only really impacted sort of temperate climates, colder climates. Emerging markets, were warmer. That emerging market populations were younger, and I guess the virus was competing with a lot of other diseases, and that the populations in these countries, would be almost more durable. And actually, the reality is that I think the realization is now dawning that actually emerging markets are in a much worse situation because, it's poor populations, poor healthcare systems, difficulty self-isolating is very difficult, and people on the breadline. And I think it's interesting to draw comparisons with 2008, 2009, which in the end, many people suffered in 0809. But actually, if I think of this crisis, I mean, if you think of the people being laid off, the first way in developed markets, for example, I mean, it's people not on fixed-term contracts, probably guest workers, if you think about it, that are going to be laid off first. So remittances is going to be a big hit that probably wasn't such a big impact in 0809. And we're still, many emerging market countries are really heavily reliant on remittances. And I guess the unfortunate, we think about this lack of coordination. So firstly, there's the denial that we're all responsible for. Emerging markets, we're part of, unfortunately, policymakers in emerging markets, I think, were party to that, this denial process. Countries are actually not very well prepared for it. Many countries, there's going to be a huge cost. I mean, it's interesting, all these huge programs have been rolled out, but in the end, someone's going to have to pay the cost of that, right? I mean, it's going to be the taxpayers or bondholders, one way or another. But in emerging markets, typically, they don't have a huge amount of fiscal space. Many of these countries already have very high debt burdens. You mentioned Turkey. Turkey obviously is in a relatively favorable position, but if you look across the emerging market spectrum, generally high public sector debt GDP ratios, much higher than going into the global financial crisis of 0809. So someone is going to have to pay for the likely big increase in government spending, or big impact on the economy, loss of revenues, and then big increase in potential healthcare outlays, and also in monetary policy space as well. Some emerging market countries have been able to cut policy rates quite easily. They have, if you think of countries in Central Europe that have pretty durable balance of payments positions, other emerging market countries that are less fortunate in terms of their balance of payments position and reserve cover and concerns about exchange rates are in not such a good position to kind of loosen the monetary strings. So actually, we're watching initially the crisis go through stages of impacting China, developed market economies, but I mean the big hit probably is going to be in emerging markets that are less able to cope with that. And in terms of coordination, I think it was also sort of disconcerting for emerging markets that the pandemic was in a way exploited by oil producers, or some of the oil producers. This big hit to global demand, they used it also to kind of crack the whip in terms of in the oil price war. So many emerging market countries are commodity dependent, many are oil dependent. So the crash in oil prices is also going to have a huge impact on you can think of countries like Nigeria, where there's going to be a huge hit in terms of the revenue stream, making them even less able to kind of cover likely increased costs of dealing with the virus. So very challenging times, and that the lack of coordination was already mentioned. We've got into the IMF meetings. Obviously, the IMF and World Bank are rolling out lots of initiatives. Debt relief is one of them for the poorest countries, particularly in Africa. But we're only starting, I guess, to think and look at the impacts on emerging market countries and developing countries. But I'm afraid, big drop in GDP, big loss of income and employment for the poorest communities, poorest populations, big increases in budget deficits, big increases in public debt. So it's a pretty challenging, very challenging period.
Thank you, Tim. Unfortunately, and thank you for flagging, especially in the oil market, is particularly very important, for the globe, and and has definitely a lot of impact as well, just on economies moving forward in many ways perspective. Before I move to Mr. Yurdakul, can you also talk briefly about the swap lines, how they are doing, and if you see any potential risk regarding the swap markets given the environment?
Sorry, is it for me? Defne,
Yeah,
is the question for me? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, a number of countries already had access to various Fed swap facilities. The assumption, they've been extended. The question mark is whether the Fed would be willing to extend it to many more emerging market countries. I mean, I think the Fed would probably be pretty reluctant because it also requires good policy. The Fed is effectively taking EM country risk on its balance sheet. So, if you look at the countries that still have access to facilities, Mexico, South Korea, Singapore, I mean, I guess they're countries that have very orthodox and credible monetary policy regimes. So I don't think we can imagine a carpet of swap facilities being rolled out by the Fed to emerging markets. The IMF is certainly stepping up and providing lots of short-term liquidity support for countries in difficulty. IMF resources are limited. Obviously, I think the very short-term liquidity support facilities have been, I think, doubled in the last 24 hours to about $100 billion. But I think around 80 countries have already requested support from the IMF. So eventually, the fund will probably have to think about accessing or trying to develop new sources of financing for itself if this pandemic continues to be, very, very impactful in terms of economies and long-lasting as well.
Thanks, Tim. I really want to move on with Mr. Hakan. Hakan Bey, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think it is important, just to hear also, just what Turkey has done so far, just for its economy and also to assure the markets. And could you summarize the measures that Turkey has taken so far, and also what are the impacts of these measures so far, and what else are in the line, moving forward, just given that Turkey is also a late catcher, in this pandemic, compared to many other countries, and still so far, compared to many other countries, the number of the, cases are relatively low, so please, Hakan Bey.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I would like to underline something that we understood from that pandemic. The first thing, it's not about economy, it's about the public health. So we are, as the economists or economy-related activities, we are just reacting to that pandemic. And the main problem of that pandemic is that we don't know when it will be finished. So it's a very big problem. Just because of that, there are two different types of strategies for the countries, including Turkey: short-term strategies and the long-term strategies. I mean, if the pandemic will be solved, the COVID-19 virus will be solved in short term, which means 3 to 6 months, it will be something. If not, it will be something else. So this is the main problem of the current situation. We don't know when. So there are two different strategies, as I said before: short-term strategies and the long-term strategies. And now for all the countries, almost all the countries, we are in fact talking about the short-term measurements regarding that issue. And the second important thing that we understood from that pandemic is that it's a lonely planet, and it's a very lonely, we are talking about very, very lonely countries, and the difference between so-called developed countries and developing countries are not too much from a public health point of view. And not only the quality of the public health services, as Mr. Akbaş stated, also the coverage of public health services is very, very important for the countries. And for Turkey, 93% of all population is covered by the public health service security, social security system. And services are almost free of charge, which means, unlike a lot of other countries, we are guaranteeing the health quality of the population, and it is very important. So at the end, with that pandemic, we are also on the same page, not on the same page about the meaning of united, the words of united and the union, because it seems everybody, every state, every country are acting very lonely regarding their public health services. So for Turkey, what the Turkish government did, and in fact, the measurements, most of them are declared on 18th of March, as you know, and these measurements are covered by the name of Economic Stability Shield, and it was in fact short-term measurements. So regarding tax and payment-related issues, payments of withholding tax returns, VAT returns, social security premiums, easement right fees, and revenue share payments related to hotel rental from public side are postponed for 6 months. And it affects more than 2 million taxpayers. And second thing regarding to tax and payment-related issues, accommodation tax is postponed to January, and VAT rate in domestic airline transport is decreased to 1% from 18%. And again, for financial support and credits related issues for the companies, firms, credit guarantee fund limit is increased to 50 million Turkish liras from 25 million Turkish liras, and with a priority to SMEs, small and medium size enterprises, and also the affected companies. Bank credit loan principal and interest payments of affected companies, again including tradesmen and craftsmen, are deferred to 3 months at minimum. So it may be more than 3 months, with additional financial support to the companies if necessary. And public bank additional credit packages for the affected companies. Principal and interest payment of the rediscounting credits is deferred to 3 months again, and loan commitment closing time for these rediscounting credits is extended by 1 year. Usage of force measures notes for affected companies for their credit registrations, credit stories allowed for 3 months, and stock financing support is provided to the exporters. Treasury support for credit insurance for SMEs is increased to 125 million Turkish liras from 25 million Turkish liras, and additional packages for tourism sector, especially for Turkey, for tourism sector. And for the employment and social support related, I mean for demand side and for citizen side, short time working allowance for 3 months, minimum wage support for 12 months for 7.8 million citizens, 1,000 Turkish liras financial support for 2.1 million households, minimum retirement pension as 1,500 Turkish liras for 650,000 retired persons, 22,000 additional employment for health professionals from public side, basic needs support credit for low income groups, and increased credible amount for the housing credits. These are the measurements that was declared by the Turkish government, on most of them on 18 March. But these measurements are based on, as I said before, short-term optimistic scenario. So what if it will be not solved in the short term in 3 to 6 months? It will be another story, and it will be, I think, the second part of this conversation. But the effect of those measurements, when we affect of those measurements, we now see that there's a huge demand decrease in retail industry, especially, and there is a decrease in capacity usage in manufacturing companies because of that pandemic. And in short term, it may be managed, but in long term, it's not like the other countries. And so when we look at the cost of these measurements, it was declared as 100 billion Turkish liras as a total cost. But when we are looking the cost to the budget, the net cost will be around, because most of them are about the postponement of the taxes. So we will collect it in optimistic scenario. So it will be around 23 billion Turkish liras, which is around 2.5% of government revenues. In pessimistic scenario, as I said before, it will take 12 to 18 months, and everything will be different for all countries, including Turkey. At the end, what we learned in that process, we learned and appreciated the importance of local manufacturing capabilities. Now, we started to manufacture some health-related stuff and disposables, like the masks, like the other ventilation systems, and coverage of social security system, as I said before, and the coverage of public health services. So these are the things that we learned, and this is the cause, and these are the measurements.
Hakan Bey, these are so useful, especially you are putting everything in a perspective, short-term regarding versus the long-term strategies is very useful, I think, and the information you share regarding, just the cost with respect to, government revenues are also valuable information, just so thank you very much. So I'm also looking at the clock. I really want to move on to the second round questions. And I really, while saying that, I will request my panelists to limit their answers to 3 minutes if possible, so we can also leave time for Q&A from the audience. And for our distinguished audience as well, please start typing your questions to the chat box if you haven't done so. So that we can actually, address and answer all of them. So thank you very much. And again, while putting your question, please do include your title and name. Josh, I would like to come back to you very quickly. And could you please talk about, just since we already discussed, actually, Hakan Akbaş mentioned and Tim also mentioned, just the just IMF and World Bank already, coming up with some measures, just during this time and already talk about some, just could you tell us a bit more in detail what the funds, plans and policies are, just in a snapshot, if you can summarize, as also given that you are a former IMF staffer yourself. So it could be good to get an insight from you. Thank you.
Of course, no, I'm happy to do that. And as Defne said, I used to work at the IMF, so that's my perspective on this. And I was there until recently. So I think that some of the measures have already been described, but maybe we could just break them down a little from the top, the 30,000-foot view. Technically, the IMF has $1 trillion in lending capacity. But when you think about what can actually go out the door, it's probably closer to 750 billion. Now, for a variety of reasons, their resources were not increased over the past year. You can say it's a lack of foresight. While growth is happening, world leaders say, why do we need to contribute more to the IMF? Of course, you need it for a rainy day. Well, now we have a storm. So that being said, the IMF has its various facilities and they've increased as much as they can, limiting concessional and non-concessional lending. So they've done a good job in short term, increasing lending to countries. And they've now had, as Kristalina Georgieva said this morning, over 90 countries come to them. Just to give perspective on that, that's half the membership. So half the membership of the IMF has asked them for additional assistance. And they will need more resources. It's just as simple as that. They will not be able to sustain the request on them without additional resources. Now, there are various ways to go about that. And you can get injections from the countries themselves. You can also trigger the special drawing rights. And I thought it was very interesting in Kristalina's speech this morning that she said we're considering looking at the special drawing rights. And that's a more detailed conversation, but it's an extraordinary measure for the IMF to take. It shows you the perspective of how deep and how intense the claims are on them right now, that they're even considering that measure. And they would put it in her major address today, which is a signal to markets and to countries as well. I also just want to make a point on the debt forgiveness, because the IMF and the World Bank have done a good job asking for the debt forgiveness. But it's very important to understand the nuance of what they're saying. They're asking for bilateral creditor debt forgiveness. They're not, at this point, taking on the step of IMF debt forgiveness, World Bank debt forgiveness. That would be an additional step that they may need to consider. So while it's good they've been calling on the bilateral creditor debt forgiveness, they haven't taken the step themselves as the international financial institutions of looking at that. And finally, just on Turkey, my perspective personally is that Turkey may come to the IMF. And I understand this is a loaded question and politically difficult question. But if you look at the options that are, facing Turkey, this is something that's going to have to be considered in the days ahead. So,
thank you for your comment, Josh. Hakan Akbaş, very quickly, I'm moving on to you because I don't want to miss the opportunity to discuss with you, just what will be the long-term effect of this crisis on economies, and what kind of structural shifts major economies will have and economic models will have, so if you can touch base on that very quickly, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Hakan.
Sure. Without any doubt, there will be significant changes as the world is struggling to find what I would call its new abnormal. It's interesting because this is no longer a financial crisis, but people are still fighting the virus, and until we have a vaccine or the entire world would have built herd immunity, it's going to be impossible for consumers, for individuals to go back to the normal, and therefore all the economies and the businesses and how we go about our daily lives will have to change until this, and let alone this will not be the first and last epidemic and a pandemic, and let alone we have other global crisis, but perhaps this will offer a new beginning. On whether a country or whether an economy will change will be a question of, will be a function of, as I said, the quality of the governance and the people's trust in that particular sort of country's economy, and obviously the public health system, which was covered earlier. So some countries, for example, just like the US, before this crisis, I mean, they had the historically low unemployment, and they were growing in the 3, 4, 5% rate. And obviously, we find US now is in a totally different shape. If you look at Brazil, for example, they had their own structural problems before the crisis. And with this COVID pandemic, things will only get obviously worse. And really, this is looking at whether we will be having global governance mechanisms like World Bank or IMF, as Josh was touching upon, would be able to adapt themselves and be really live up to the crisis to be able to coordinate a response. Also, this pandemic has shown that there is a lot of inequalities, and before that, it was obvious. This made it even worse. So going forward, we will have more social problems facing the governments, which will require obviously even bigger bailouts, which will in its turn increase the level of debtness when it comes to households, when it comes to businesses or countries. Again, Josh touched upon the trillions of dollars that Fed has been pumping to the economy. So what we will likely see also, the governments, what I would call, go back to state capitalism. As you've seen in this crisis, countries were struggling to come up with masks, medical supplies, ventilators, and for example, Turkey is importing its pharma supplies from abroad, and US, basically, they are dependent on China and India. What we will see is basically the state, probably the big government effect, where they will have to either play a role as a state, or they will have to perhaps even take equity in some of these strategic, basically, industries. And again, it will never be the same because if you look at, for example, countries like China, they can no longer continue their export dependent growth after the crisis, because the demand will not be there, and pretty much in the next year or two, it will have to be a different growth engine, which may again, which inevitably expedite the structural changes in China. And last but not least, obviously, this is a global crisis, and the more the countries will basically live up to the task, whether it's the G20, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's making WHO work more effectively without politicizing it, I think will be very important. On a positive note, actually, younger demographics, has been an advantage. So countries like Turkey that has younger population versus some of the OPEC countries with older population will obviously come out of this, and their economies will likely be less adversely impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan. Tim, just your second round question. Can you hear me? Okay. While moving on to Tim, maybe we can go, just over time, maybe 5 more minutes, given that we have a very interesting discussion. Tim, can you talk about, talking about, just the disrupted economic models, just can we also talk about a bit very quickly how the financial markets will be disrupted, just what the global bond market, just how the hedge funds behavior will be, have already, changed, and how it will be changed, and where will be the major areas to invest, and what the investors will be looking at in this new normal. Just can you summarize a bit, just touch base on these points very briefly?
So easy question. Really?
Good.
Let's hope we all survive this. Let's hope we all survive this to start with, both individually and kind of professionally. I mean, massive market dislocation. I mean, huge moves, huge winners, huge losers. I mean, I guess we're all going through the same process. It's just so disruptive to everything we do. I mean, just think about, we're all working from home. I mean, we may, when we go back to work, I mean, the whole work-life balance is going to change. I mean, there are so many businesses that, that may need to change the way they operate, and also countries. So, I mean, I guess in my job, we're going through countries, we're stress testing countries, we're trying to figure out, winners. Well, looking at the ones that are vulnerable. Obviously, I mentioned before, the growth slowdown, debt sustainability, impacts on balance of payments, remittances. There are some winners, oil price winners, some oil price losers. But I mean, it's just so enormous, the kind of what we're going through. It's I mean, I guess just some basic questions and following on what people have already said. For me, I mean, the first question is, and I already mentioned it in a way that who's going to pay for this in the end? I mean, there's a huge amount of debt been piled on. I think we are going to see debt relief in many countries, but ultimately taxes are going to go higher, right? And I guess the assumption has always been that, or the assumption had been, if you look at the initial China impact, was that there'd be a V-shaped recovery, right? But actually, we're all going to come out of this with a lot more debt. So I guess paying for it is going to take a long time. There's going to be a huge drag of increased taxation. The role of the state, post this, I mean, many states are intervening and to try and save companies. The state's going to have lots of equity stakes globally in many places that we'd have never imagined. I mean, the whole globalization thing. I guess one big takeout is, I think it's probably already been mentioned, but there'll be a diffusion of global supply chains. So people will be, I guess, diversifying out of China. And who are the winners from that, for example? I mean, Turkey I was in Turkey a month ago, and a lot of Turkish big holding companies were very confident that Turkey would be a winner, that big multinationals would look to locate part of their supply chains in somewhere like Turkey that, is a big country, big domestic market, young population, strong manufacturing tradition. And so they were pretty optimistic they would win on that. I'd also say, in terms of, it's interesting that some of the deniers, some of the countries that are behind the curve, perhaps, in terms of accepting the threat from the virus, have also been led by more populist leaders, for example. And I guess, will those countries be more impacted by the virus because their leaders were somehow behind the curve? And what will be the response? Will we see one of the reactions to this, that there's a reflection on the demise of the multilateral approach to things, and actually there'll be a rejuvenation of focus on institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and G20, and that the world does need a multilateral approach to problems. Or will these populist leaders double down and if they are more aggressively impacted by the virus, will they blame foreigners and it's a China virus kind of scenario? I don't know. I mean, the big theme globally has been deglobalization, populism, and what does that mean for that kind of theme? So I'm not sure I really answered your question there, but it's just so huge, right? I mean, look at the market moves. This is bigger. It's bigger than 08, 09, right?
Indeed, you did. As you said, just the main thing is that, the world will end up with a huge debt amount, and who will pay this, is a big question. And in addition to that, that's for sure that, the government at the end of this process, government ownership will increase, just globally, I think, this is also, in a way, actually, probably the government and the whole world needs to go 5 steps back before moving forward, just globally. And anyway, without further delay, Hakan Bey, Mr. Hakan Yurdakul, I want to turn to you again. Just if we can talk about a bit more sector-wise, just which sectors of the economy have been mostly affected, you think, in Turkey, and what other steps we should expect Turkey to take and will take, even though you touched base a bit, on that, especially on the long-term measures that you in your earlier remarks. And also, I would like to note that Fitch, even despite this going on pandemic, recently said that they still expect 0.8% growth for this year for Turkey, even though it came down from the early expectations, still a positive level, and a jump of to 4.5% next year. Do you see that this is an expectable? I mean, this is a realistic expectation by Fitch, and what is your expectation?
Thank you. First of all, the sectors, the industries that will be affected because of this pandemic will be retail, of course, including shopping malls, iron steel industry, automotive, logistic and transportation, cinema and theatre, accommodation, food and beverage, textile, garment and event organization sectors, as it was declared in the Shield documents. But we know that all the sectors, directly or indirectly, will be affected if it will go long. So it's again short term or long term. This is the main question. And we should also include the private hospitals and the health service providers in Turkey. They will be also affected. So the main problem from that point of view is, and because as a reply also some of the question, is not about to take money or to have a collaboration with IMF or not. I mean, we know that money easing, quantitative easing is not a solution, whole solution. The main problem is demand. So where is the demand? How we will increase the demand? So because the main problem that we are facing with is the decreasing of demand, both internal and external demand. So this is the main problem. And to take the money for investments or for the other things has a secondary importance from that point of view. From government point of view, in the long term, the main issue will be that how the companies will face with the current operating costs. I mean, except some very giant technology companies in US, no company has enough cash for the long term. I mean, after 3 months or 6 months or 10 months, let me say that they will be out of money, cash. So the operating cost will be a very, very big problem. So regarding that issue in the long term, the Turkish government is now planning how to support firms about that issue. And it also includes the selection of strategic sectors and regions from both employment and also production output point of view. But again, the demand is the most important thing. So in long term, the most important issue is how to sustain economic cycle, okay, with a decrease in demand. So it's not only about to survive. In short term, it's okay. But in long term, if we don't have enough demand and supply, there will be a bigger problem for all population, more than pandemic. So it's the main problem. And in that issue, perception is very important. If you are talking about some very pessimistic perceptions about the future because of that pandemic, it will be in that way or that way. So perception management, and for Turkey, especially exports are very important. I mean, we learned that in that process, every country is alone. Okay, first. I mean, secondly, in that issue, to create some sustainable and trustable relation between some countries will be very, very important from an export point of view, because internal demand is something. Okay, we have a mid-size population, mid-size demand. So inside, but external demand will be also important. So in the long term, Turkey government, like in short term, will be focused on exports. And for exports, again, the localization, I mean, local manufacturing capabilities, muscles are very, very important, and we know that. In the operation of Turkish military, we understood the manufacturing capabilities of defense industry in Turkey, and with that pandemic, we also learned and understood the quality and the capability of the Turkish health manufacturing industries, including pharma, including medical devices and medical disposables. We know that we can do it, so we will do it. And also it's a subject of the exports. And at the end, it's a global pandemic disease. And so the local muscles are very important. And from a social security point of view, most of the population in Turkey is covered by the social security system, unlike some other countries. And the money that you should pay for a solution to that pandemic is very low in Turkey. I mean, in most of the countries, if you have enough money, you can survive, you can live. In some of the countries, you cannot. So this is a very big problem for the countries. So in Turkey, it's not the case. When we look at for the last 7 years, for each 1,000K population, we saw that the number of the hospital beds increased 40% in Turkey. Number of health professions increased 20%. For 100,000 citizens I'm talking about, 27% increase in medical devices, number of the medical devices, again, for 100K population. And the number of the medical students in universities of Turkey is also very interesting. Now we have medical students in Turkish universities with the more or less same number as the health professions in the market. So in 5 to 10 years, we will double the number of health professions, which is very important. And it's also same for the foreign students in Turkey going health, medicine, medical related departments of the faculties. We have totally around 8,000 foreign students in Turkish medical faculties. And at the end, the fight against that virus is also about to minimize the effect till a vaccine or any other treatment will be found. Okay, so we are now waiting. We are now waiting for the absolute solution. But after that pandemic, there may be another pandemic. Okay, there may be another wave. So it's all about to be ready to how to survive with that things. So at the end, from an economic point of view, show must go on, and for till August 2018, you know that all the different parties are saying that Turkey should go to IMF, Turkey should do something regarding to central bank reserves, regarding to other issues, but nothing happened. I mean, for example, for the central bank reserve related issues, we should check the short-term liabilities and the central bank reserves. Okay, we should compare these things. And for the private side or total debt related issues, we should also check the total FX assets of all entities in Turkey in the banks and the total debt level. I mean, it's still very sustainable when it's compared with the other countries all over the globe. So this is the case, and it will be a new world. And in that new world, things, including the business models, collaboration models, and the other models, and the role of the government, role of the private entities, I mean companies, will be very different. And the main thing that are talking about this pandemic is that there will be a rule in the future, in the near future, big technology giants and also professionals. Okay, will take the all responsibility of how to rule the systems, which means like a utopic dream of someone's. But in that case, like China's big social experience, everything will be managed by the technology, by the big data, and it's a very horrible future for all mankind. So we should find a way how to collaborate in both community level and state level. I believe in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yurdakul. Very useful. Without further delay, I really want to move on to questions, and I just added, I already added 5 minutes and 5 more minutes, so we will finish at 6:10 sharp. And we have so many questions and all interesting. So I really apologize if we leave out some of the questions because there are so many flowing right now. The first one, actually, to all panelists from one of our audience, I'm just reading from our chat box. With regard to FDI, it is expected that the goods are expected to be produced in closer where they are consumed. And also the multinationals are expected to more focus on supply chain security rather than the profitability. So far, Turkey, after the virus has been taken under control, can we expect more FDI inflows to Turkey, especially from East Asian multinationals or other which use China as a production base? Thank you. I think we already spoke about this, but maybe Hakan Bey, can you, Mr. Yurdakul, reply on this very quickly?
I think it's all about how we will distribute the risk, okay, from a big multinational company's point of view. I think it will be a good idea. It may be a good idea for some of MNEs to have some facilities also in Turkey regarding to risk in China. Yes. So the question is yes. From risk management perspective, I believe in that some of the multinationals operate their own facilities in Turkey.
Okay, I do think that this trend will go, just continue to increase globally anyway, just especially a lot of countries will be more starting producing internally, and this really have an impact on the, supply chain and the export volumes globally moving forward. That's what I think. But in addition to that, I want to move on with another question. This is a bit tricky one, and so what is the panel's view on the likelihood of IMF intervention in Turkey, given the country's depleting US dollar reserves combined with the planned COVID-related fiscal deficit? Do you think Turkey, like many other countries, many other EM, should consider turning to the fund for their help, given that these are extraordinary times? Does the panel foresee a much higher inflation environment going forward? The IMF is pushing out money without as much as conditionality these days. No, question mark. So can we comment on that very quickly? I can very briefly answer this. I really don't expect, honestly, Turkey turn to its face to IMF right now. And on the inflation front, I think demand conditions are not that supportive yet, but we cannot know, just moving forward. But I'd like to ask this question to Hakan Akbaş. Hakan, can you please answer this question?
Okay, let me unmute myself first. I think it's going to be a question of how long this outbreak will last. And if a vaccine is 12 to 18 months out, and if you're looking at different cycles of outbreak potentially dying or coming back in September, this will really determine the depth of the fiscal need that Turkey will need to take on. So it will depend on how long this will last. And this is also a question of how quickly demand, as Mr. Yurdakul pointed out, will come back.
Okay, Mr. Yurdakul, do you want to also make a comment on this?
I think, as I said before, it is all about demand, and IMF is just one of the sources for money if we need it, and I am not very sure if we will need or not. It depends on the solution of that pandemic in short term or long term.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. And also, just one of the audience actually touched base on the agriculture sector, which I think we left out. So thank you for flagging this. What will be the COVID-19 will impact on the agriculture sectors and also raw material market in the agriculture sector? Who can take on this question? Hakan, Akbaş, or can you, or just, or Josh, do you want to comment?
Let me just say that with this crisis, we've seen that some needs are essential, whether it's the medicines, whether it's the masks, or it's what we eat every day. So agriculture inevitably will have to come back to the front burners of Turkey. And obviously there is already been efforts to localize seed production and identifying the categories of producers to be then regionalized and coordinated by Ankara. So I think this COVID-19 epidemic will only put a higher priority on it, and this will put it among the strategic sectors in Turkey.
Okay, thank you very much. Just so, and I'll check just one last question. Tim, maybe you can step in here. You have been a long-term follower of Turkey, and what will be the new normal for the globe and Turkey, and whether what would you like to comment on the Turkish Central Bank response to the current situation addressing the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things I'll link them. There's obviously IMF, central bank, and FDI. On the FDI front, I mean, I know I suggested that Turkey might benefit from this diffusion of global supply chains, but actually the reality is FDI has been pretty disappointing in Turkey in the last sort of 5-6 years. I mean, if you remember the peak just before the global financial crisis, I mean, I think it was 2007 was like $20 billion net FDI. And in the last couple of years, it's been 7 billion, which is really disappointing for a country that, has a good business environment, should be, young population, big dynamic, it should be getting a lot more FDI. So I think the country needs to ask itself, why not, And I guess I would say the answer to that is macro stability, macro financial stability, concern about, the 2018 crisis, the policy reaction since, and just linking back then into reserves and the IMF. I mean, look, the reality, even before the virus, right? I mean, Turkey was really struggling with this FX management kind of regime. Now, the high dollarization, and then the recycling of FX deposits through swaps to state banks to support the currency, because basically the administration was desperate to cut rates, to credit growing, was worried about the lira, was trying to manage lira weakness. And actually, to be honest, what we've seen since the virus has been an acceleration of pressure on the exchange rate, if anything. And the reserve loss that we've seen since the beginning of the year is really disturbing. And I think we've seen around $35 billion loss of reserves. We're at kind of critical level. I mean, Turkey started without a huge FX reserve cover. If you look at, reserve coverage ratios, it's one of the lowest in emerging markets. And we're approaching kind of critical levels. I mean, it depends which way you measure net international reserves, but basically probably negative, probably significantly negative. And, the longer this goes on, I think, Turkey needs to find some extra FX liquidity from somewhere. And the obvious place is the IMF now. I know Erdogan has been pretty critical in the past of the fund, but, the fund is now rolling out lots of new programs, or this RFI facility that has no conditionality. I think Erdogan was quite interesting at the G20 conference call a couple of weeks ago. He kind of said interesting things about swaps and all that kind of gig. I mean, I think the RFI could be a conduit to an improvement in the relationship with the IMF that might open the window for something more substantive in terms of the relationship. It's clear this is not sustainable for Turkey. Something has to give. They don't have enough reserves to defend the exchange rate. the policy of negative real rates, continue to cut policy rates at all costs. Something has to give, either the exchange rate or they have to find some additional liquidity from somewhere. So it's going to end in something, and I would think it's probably the IMF.
Thank you, Tim. But before we close up very quickly, I would like to also ask my panelists if any one of you would like to make a last moment comment. Josh, Hakan Akbaş, Mr. Hakan Yurdakul. So would you like to add anything or answer anything that has been just raised?
Just thank you.
Okay. So I'm closing up, and thank you all again for being with us here today, even virtually. I would like especially to thank to our distinguished speaker, Hakan Akbaş, Tim Ash, Josh Lipsky, and Mr. Hakan Yurdakul for taking the time. And finally, big thanks to our partners whose support makes this event possible. And also, I would like to give also a huge thank to my great team, Pınar Dost, Grady Wilson, Jackson, Bridget, and Tom Knoll from Washington, D.C. for making this event to happen. I'm also excited to announce two upcoming Atlantic Council Turkey program events next week. On Tuesday 14, in partnership with Turkish Heritage Organization, we will be hosting His Excellency Mr. Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Turkey's Foreign Minister, for a discussion covering coronavirus, Syria, refugees, and more. And on Wednesday, April 15, we will be hosting an event on impact of COVID on the global energy sector and reflections on Turkey. We will be sending out the invitations later this week, and I encourage you to also to follow us on Twitter as AC_Istanbul, and please visit the Atlantic Council webpage in the coming days for more information and for other future details. Thank you, and until next time and next week, stay healthy and well. Thank you so much.